The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just going to give maybe 30 seconds for more attendees to file in a bit, and then we will get started. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is our latest entry in the Rights of Way Invasive Plant Management webinar series. This is our fourth installment, and we will be discussing invasive Phragmites today. So our three featured speakers, Dr. Christine Rohal, Chelsey Blanke, and Loni Anderson, will provide background on invasive Phragmites and why its management is important. They will each discuss their respective experiences managing and monitoring these species and will provide guidance and resources on what they have found to be effective to address both large-scale and emergent populations. We will have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for audience questions and discussions. So please submit any questions you have in the chat throughout the presentation, and we will be sure to address them. Our hosts for today's webinar are Ashley Bennett from the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, myself, Allison Little from University of Illinois Chicago, and Catherine O'Reilly, also from University of Illinois Chicago. Couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Please keep your audio muted and your video off throughout the duration of the presentation. If you're having any technical issues, please send a direct message to Catherine O'Reilly via the chat, and they will be able to assist you. And then for all other questions and comments, please just submit it to the general Q&A box. And again, we'll address those at the end of the presentation. And then just a reminder, we are recording this presentation and we will share it with the group afterwards. All right, and I am pleased to introduce today's presenters. So we have three great presenters today. First up will be Christine. Dr. Christine Rohal is a research scientist at the University of Florida working on projects informing the restoration of native plant species in wetland and aquatic ecosystems. Christine got her PhD working with Dr. Karen Kettering at Utah State University, focusing on assessing different methods for managing Phragmites across diverse environmental contexts. Together, they have co-authored 7 papers on Phragmites management and native plant recovery, evaluating methods ranging from different herbicides, mowing, and cattle grazing. Our second presenter is Chelsey Blanke, who is a researcher at University of Minnesota focused on invasive species and ecological restoration. She works closely with Julia Bonin, Dan Larkin, and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and many local managers to coordinate statewide control of invasive Phragmites. She previously worked on aquatic plant management and invasive species prevention and response at the Minnesota DNR and the Wisconsin DNR. Chelsey has an MS in freshwater science and a BS in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And finally, we have Loni Anderson from the Minnesota Department of Transportation's Metro District. For the past 6 years, Loni's summer position has been with the herbicide crew at the East Central Metro Weed Identifier. One of her biggest projects in this role is to identify, track, and treat European common reed, otherwise known as Phragmites, which she likes to call nature's invasive ninja. Phragmites can be challenging as crazy commuters in winter, which is when her title changes to transportation generalist, where her focus becomes on snow plowing and all things highway maintenance. So to kick things off, I am going to hand it over to Christine for her presentation.
Thanks so much, Allison. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about some of the research insights that I've had along with my advisor, Karen Kettering, on invasive Phragmites and how we can best manage it, especially at large spatial scales. Okay, let me just There we go. So as I mentioned, I worked with Karin Kettering, who's the professor at Utah State University. And so I did a lot of work on Phragmites management while I was her student, along with a number of other grad students. And this presentation will highlight some of that work along with some insights from work that Karin has done within regions all across North America. So just kind of a brief outline of where I'm headed with my section of the talk. I'll first talk a little bit about the history, mechanisms, and impacts of the invasion of Phragmites in North America. Then I'll move on to talk about some of the best management practices we've found for both the control of Phragmites as well as its containment and prevention of further spread. And then I'll finish talking about some considerations for site prioritization. So for those who may be unfamiliar, we're talking about invasive non-native Phragmites australis, which is a tall-statured perennial wetland grass. I would say that biomass is its superpower. It can create this huge, immense amount of above-ground biomass as well as below-ground biomass. And every winter that biomass dies back, but it doesn't go anywhere, it just kind of stays there. And so over multiple years, you just have this dense thicket of living and dead biomass that just forms dense monocultures as far as the eye can see under the right conditions. You may have heard that there's a native Phragmites in North America. It tends to play a little nicer with its neighbors, but the subspecies of Phragmites that we're concerned about is Phragmites australis, which is the invasive strain. And this is what has been taking over wetlands across North America. It's believed that it arrived in North America as early as the early 1900s, perhaps even earlier, maybe in the ballasts of ships, kind of on the northeastern coast. And it's really rapidly expanded, especially in the last couple of decades across wetlands all over North America. So here's an EdMaps figure of where Phragmites is recently, the invasive strain of Phragmites has been found, and it's everywhere, especially in kind of the northeastern wetlands, the region around the Great Lakes and the Great Salt Lake out in Utah where I worked. So one of the reasons why Phragmites has so effectively spread is because it is very effective at reproducing both clonally as well as sexually. So an individual clone can expand outward through these underground stems called rhizomes, overground stems called stolons, and each of these stems at every node can produce a vertical shoot that during the fall creates one of these pretty fluffy inflorescences that can hold many thousands of wind-pollinated seeds. So getting a little more deeply into these, this kind of reproduction mechanism, early in Phragmites invasion, it was expected that it was primarily spreading mostly by way of rhizomes and stolons, kind of clonal expansion. But recent work by Karin and other researchers has shown that there can be really high amounts of Phragmites genetic diversity, both within patches as well as across the landscape. And so the only way that we can get that high level of genetic diversity is through seed-based reproduction. And this can really create a feedback loop that just creates more and more seeds, because those more highly diverse patches have more pollen exchange, which creates more viable seed and then just further fuels the invasion. We also know that Phragmites is a disturbance specialist. Phragmites seeds are light limited, so they need some sort of physical disturbance to the wetland to clear out the above ground vegetation, have some bare soil exposed, and that's what it really needs to colonize by way of seed. In addition, Phragmites is a nutrient specialist and really thrives in areas with extra nutrients, often associated with human habitats, agriculture, that kind of thing. And these increased nutrients really benefit multiple phases of Phragmites life, including its kind of flower and floret production is increased. A seedling can go from being small to rather large more quickly when there's more nutrients, and that helps it overcome that more vulnerable phase and makes the reinvasion or new invasion more successful. And then all those nutrients help fuel all that biomass that is so effective at expanding and outcompeting native plants. So you may be thinking that roadsides have a lot of those conditions that really support Phragmites expansion. And that's been supported by a number of research papers that have highlighted how roadsides are really effective pathways for Phragmites to spread, kind of like corridors for these thousands of seeds to funnel along, and the disturbance really encourage the seed germination and spread within those areas in rather short timelines. So many are probably familiar with the kind of extreme impacts that Phragmites can have. For humans, it really limits the accessibility of wetlands, limiting recreation in those areas, and along roadsides that can be really problematic for the line of sight. It really is a big concern for habitat because by replacing the native plants that produce, more rich seeds for food for animals or greater floral resources, the thickets of Phragmites are really a poor substitute for that. The seeds are not good food, and it really, if people can't get through it, animals can't either. And also there are potential impacts to fire and water availability. All of that dead plant material can be a fire hazard, and when lit can cause threats to air quality, which is a concern in Utah, especially where air quality is already pretty bad. And all that biomass sucks up a lot of water. So in areas where water is scarce, it can be a concern. So moving on to the management, how do we reduce the impacts of Phragmites, particularly across large spatial scales where kind of intensive management is not always possible everywhere? And so I'll first talk a little bit about how we might contain and prevent Phragmites further expansion, strategic removal using herbicides, and site prioritization. So as I mentioned, Phragmites seed reproduction is really problematic, and there's just a huge and immense propagal pressure that can come from Phragmites patches. So a single inflorescence can produce as many as 3,000 seeds, and this can spread the invasion beyond the patch, and it also can lay many thousands of seeds within a patch, which really challenges the management when you're trying to remove it as well, because you've got a kind of a bed of seeds below. And we found very high seed bank densities when we studied that within kind of established patches of Phragmites in Utah. So the good news is that we've also found some management tools that can greatly reduce Phragmites inflorescence and therefore seed production. One of the best and most commonly used tools is mowing. So if you can mow Phragmites during the summer months, that doesn't kill Phragmites, but it knocks it back, and it struggles to produce inflorescences in the fall of that year. Similarly, cattle grazing can reduce that biomass during the summer months when the cattle would have good forage, and once again that limits the seed production that fall. Anecdotally, managers have seen in Utah, where drought stress is common, that in areas where Phragmites is drought stressed, it really doesn't produce many seeds. So that's, in places where water control is possible, you can drought the patch, and that's just another tool for limiting seed production. And what we found is that these interventions really can make a difference, at least at the local scale. We measured those seed banks of Phragmites that had been managed in the summer months over 3 years, and we found that the seed bank could be reduced by as much as 1/2 to 2/3 within those years. So it is an effective tool. But all those summer interventions don't kill the plant. So in order to remove it, especially at larger spatial scales, the most commonly used tool is herbicide. And there are two aquatically approved herbicides that are common in North American wetlands. There's glyphosate, which is essentially your aquatic Roundup. And then there's imazapyr, which is a little more expensive. It's a little less common, but often considered when you know, the Roundup resistance is a concern. So for my PhD research, we did a number of experiments looking at both the fall and summer application of imazapyr and glyphosate. And one of our top findings is that the fall application was much better than the summer application, particularly over the longer term. And we believe the reason why is because when you spray it in the fall, this is the time when the plant is kind of shuffling, it's kind of translocating the sugars from the leaves to its roots. And so in doing so, it's pulling the herbicide down into the roots, more effectively killing both the above and below ground vegetation. We did not see a significant difference between imazapyr and glyphosate. They're both kind of similarly effective at reducing Phragmites cover within wetlands, but under all the cases where we sprayed herbicide over the 3 treatment years we tested, Phragmites was never eradicated, and so it really reinforced the kind of idea that long-term application and kind of follow-up treatments are really needed to prevent reinvasion. So herbicide, when done alone, is fairly ineffective because if you don't have some form of biomass reduction alongside it, then all of that dead biomass of Phragmites remains, shading out the marsh surface and really limiting opportunities for native plants to germinate and kind of facilitating the reinvasion of Phragmites. So there are a number of tools for biomass reduction. Cattle grazing, mowing, and burning are 3 of them, the main ones. And each of them comes with different considerations and limitations. So as I mentioned, summer mowing is really effective for removing Phragmites seed production, and so can be combined with fall herbicide treatments. And that's probably our most recommended kind of treatment combination. However, mowing wetlands in the summer can come with challenges. It's usually a time when it's a lot wetter and muddier, so equipment can get stuck. You have to have, the right equipment for those type of conditions. And so in those cases, winter mowing is also effective and typically comes with harder ground and less challenges of getting stuck. Mowing also leaves a very thick and dense litter layer. All that biomass that was standing then just gets kind of laid down on the ground and takes multiple years to degrade. And so this can be a barrier, at least in the short term, for native plant recovery. Burning does not have that same issue. It clears out all of the dead matter, vegetation, but there's a lot of limitations for getting burning in especially human-dominated landscapes. Permitting can be an issue, and so it's really kind of only possible under certain cases. Cattle grazing also kind of requires special conditions to be able to use. You need to be able to have large areas where the cattle can roam and can be fenced in. In Utah, it's actually increasingly being used. The managers of these kind of large-scale wetlands and local cattle grazers have a kind of a working relationship where the cattle grazers get free feed for their cattle, and the managers get some of those biomass removal benefits from the cattle. But you need kind of wetland hardy cattle, and it also comes with its own challenges. So when you go in and you remove Phragmites using herbicides over multiple years, your ideal outcome would be kind of a rapid reintroduction of invasive or of native plant species. Hopefully, ones that have good habitat value, like perennial graminoids or forbs. And so that's the ideal. This kind of a quick return of native plants. It is also very important for invasion resistance because, as I said, those kind of bare soils are perfect germination grounds for Phragmites. So unfortunately, the reality is that we see very variable recovery of native plant species across a variety of different landscape contexts and environmental conditions. So in some cases, we see very little to no native plant recovery. And in other cases, we see a diversity of plant species returning, which kind of quickly take over that bare soil. And in those cases, Phragmites cover tends to be limited. There's fewer opportunities for seed germination and reinvasion. So those areas that have those more beneficial conditions tend to be regions that have a greater amount of native plants, native wetland plants in the surrounding landscape. So those provide propagules for the exposed ground. In some cases, it can expand into those areas through rhizomes, like the picture on the bottom left. And so those are really the best case scenario for getting the native plants to recover. The environmental context of a plot can also influence the effectiveness of the herbicide. So we found in Utah, where drought is common, Phragmites that was stressed, drought stressed especially, just didn't kind of effectively translocate that herbicide, and so the plant was not effectively killed or removed. So similar stressful conditions like high salinity or sulfide might also kind of limit herbicide effectiveness. And again, the landscape, both the distance to healthy wetlands as well as the diversity of plants within the surrounding wetlands of a patch you might choose to try to treat, really influence the treatment outcomes. So just to kind of conclude my presentation, I just wanted to kind of review some of the take-homes in terms of the management of Phragmites. So to best contain Phragmites, to keep it from spreading, especially by seed, but also through clonal expansion, impacting it in the summer is essential. So that could be through grazing, burning, or mowing. I didn't mention it before, but if your part of your management regime includes mowing of non-invaded wetlands, if it's possible to avoid those kind of less impacted wetlands during the late spring and early summer when the Phragmites germination period is kind of at its peak, then that would reduce the chances that those disturbances would lead to a new Phragmites reinvasion. And finally, for removing Phragmites, the best strategy you may have would be to impact it in the summer by way of mowing or grazing or burning, just to remove its chances to produce seeds, and then following up with herbicide in the fall. But in cases when that's not possible, herbicide in the fall followed by burning or mowing in the winter or spring is also effective. But kind of keeping in mind that when you choose to do herbicide treatments, long-term follow-up will be needed, or else reinvasion is very likely. And then I just wanted to highlight how, prioritizing small emerging patches, which is what the next speakers will be talking about. And I'm sure they'll explain some more about why that's very effective. It's effective in other ways too, in terms of your management outcomes, because those are the type of patches that you're most likely to get the rapid native plant recovery, which will produce the habitat as well as limit reinvasion to those areas. And so with that, I'll let Chelsey take over.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine. That was a great overview. And it's great to be here with the Right-of-Way Habitat Working Group to talk more specifically about some work we're doing on invasive Phragmites in Minnesota. So my name is Chelsey Blanke again. I'm a researcher at the University of Minnesota Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. And along with my colleague, Julia Bonin, who's on the call here too, we coordinate control of invasive Phragmites throughout the state. So this is kind of a hopeful story, what we have going on here in Minnesota, where we're seeing success in kind of reversing and containing the spread of the species that we actually detected early, and are working to do a really science-based landscape scale control effort. So starting in 2017, my colleagues, Dan Larkin, Julia, and Sue Galadowicz noticed invasive Phragmites showing up in Minnesota, and they were familiar with it from it being widespread in other parts of the country, and began to document its distribution through crowdsourcing and targeted surveillance efforts. And by 2019, the documented distribution was around 400 populations. So we brought those findings to the DNR and other, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and other state agencies, as well as local partners, and kind of made a push for this landscape scale control effort. And then following that, the DNR Invasive Species Program decided to apply for funding from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to kick off this statewide effort. So the DNR has hired a contractor annually since 2019 to help control all known invasive Phragmites in Minnesota. Our local partners are a really important part of this as well. There is a coalition of organizations, including tribal natural resource agencies around the Duluth Superior area, so around kind of the southwestern tip of Lake Superior, that have been controlling invasive Phragmites already in that area since 2017. And we work with a lot of other local partners as well. So you can see here, we have a lot of local leaders in certain counties, as well as the Minnesota Department of Transportation in the greater Twin Cities Metro. And as you know, Loni is here to speak more about their work in more detail in a few minutes here. And so Julia and I coordinate and kind of help keep track of all these populations, sort out who's treating what, compile information on treatments being conducted, so we can kind of track the progress of what's happening with invasive Phragmites throughout the state, sort of see how we're doing as far as the status of those populations. Are they decreasing in size? How many have been removed? That kind of thing. So our goal of this effort is really to reverse and contain the spread of invasive Phragmites in Minnesota. And the methods that we're using to control invasive Phragmites are based on a literature review conducted by a researcher in our lab named Anna Peschel that really agreed with all of the things that Christine outlined. So following that, the process that we are using, our statewide contractor uses, and that we're seeing good results with is to apply imazapyr, sometimes glyphosate, once a year, again in the late summer or early fall. The reason that we apply it this time of year is because that's when the Phragmites is translocating its resources, as well as the herbicide down to the roots. So it's critical to be able to kill the rhizomes of the plant. And again, just want to emphasize the importance of this optimal timing for getting the most effective treatment and avoiding really like unnecessary herbicide treatments multiple times a year. So we have been saying that optimal timing is going to be anytime after August 1st until we finally get a hard frost in the fall. That August 1st is something that we, arguably it's summertime yet, but it allows our contractor to have a little bit more time to get all the work done that they need to get done as well. So anytime in that window is kind of when we think the sweet spot is. And 2 to 4 years of these kind of optimally timed treatment is what we expect will be needed to eliminate most of the populations that we're dealing with, depending on the size of the patch. A couple of resources I wanted to highlight here are these that are available on our website, which is minfrag.org. So we have those best management practices. If you go to this management recommendations tab here, so you can read more about those management approaches that we use. And we also have a really nice identification guide for how to distinguish invasive and native Phragmites. And there's a lot of other resources available on that site that might be useful to some of you as well. Another really important piece of our landscape scale control effort is monitoring. So every year since 2022, we've been really lucky to have a conservation corps crew working with us, hired through the Minnesota DNR to visit populations that have been treated and track how large they are, whether they're still there, etc. And we keep track of all this information using EdMaps. One particular issue that I wanted to highlight for this group is how we've been working with railroad companies that have invasive Phragmites growing along their rights of way. So we work with hundreds of individual landowners on this effort to get permission to conduct treatments of the Phragmites on their properties. And we've had variable success and experiences working with the various railroad companies. So the ones that we are mainly dealing with are Canadian Pacific, Union Pacific, BNSF, and the Canadian National Railway. And as I said, we've had variable experiences with these based on their different processes. Invasive Phragmites is regulated in Minnesota so that landowners are required to conduct control in order to prevent its spread. But we're trying to make it easy for them essentially by offering to come and have the contractor take care of the treatments for them. A couple of them are very cooperative. They just ask the DNR's contractor to share when they're going to be out there. In a few cases, they've provided kind of like an escort in case of any safety concerns, but essentially they're just make it easy for the contractor to conduct the treatments. Another company has begun to conduct treatments through their own contractors. Obviously, the railroads have other weed control needs that need to be taken care of, so they've just sort of looped control of invasive Phragmites into that. And then with this final company, we have not had any luck getting permission for the statewide contractor or getting any action really on their part to control invasive Phragmites. We've tried just about everything we can. We've tried to work through their permitting processes, but they had massive fees they wanted to charge us for our contractor to get access. Even though, as I said, we're essentially trying to kind of help take care of their issue. And they also kind of, quote, had no interest in having their contractors take care of the invasive Phragmites themselves. So something I'm just very interested in I'm interested in others' experiences working with railways. If you have any information that you think we might be missing, if you've had success working with some of these railways, please contact me. I'd appreciate the chance just to kind of compare notes on this. And you can reach us at phragmites@umn.edu. And I'll show that email address on my final slide here. So just to kind of wrap up, what I want to share is that we are seeing success. So we're aware of just under 2,300 verified populations in Minnesota, totaling only around 170 acres. 2/3 of those are smaller in area than a tennis court, and around half are smaller than a large living room. And we're, as of last year, and in our monitoring, we're seeing around a quarter of populations that have been treated are no longer present. So we really aim to meet this goal of reversing and containing the spread with persistence and surveillance, conducting the necessary 2 to 4 years of treatment on each population, monitoring, and adaptive management. We really think it's going to be possible. And last couple things to kind of keep in mind. I want to just emphasize the risk of potential spread via mowing. Invasive Phragmites can spread from any part of the plant, as we discussed. So it's really important that if it is mowed, that the equipment is cleaned adequately. as Christine mentioned, mowing isn't a viable method for working toward actually removing a patch because it's not going to impact those rhizomes. And I also want to emphasize just again the importance of monitoring and follow-up to allow that adaptive management approach. And finally, I just want to mention considering active revegetation. As you may know, opening up, as we talked about, these patches could lead to reinvasion or invasion by other undesirable weedy plants. So you might want to consider seeding of desirable species if invasive Phragmites is able to be removed, whether that be with, a real functional or utilitarian seed mix, maybe some kind of pollinator-friendly seed mix or otherwise. So last, I just want to acknowledge all of our many partners involved in this effort, and I will send it over to Loni.
Hello. Thank you so much, Chelsey. Allison, you want to flip to the next slide, please? So I work for MnDOT. I was mainly hired for snowplow removal or driver. Unfortunately, that's all I get to do from the fall, from late fall into springtime. Minnesota is broke up into all different districts here. I'm from the Metro District. We have 8 counties. We have 3,237 square miles of area to cover. And then we also have 18 truck stations, all with their own crews that mow and supervisors. So the herbicide crew in the summer, we consist of 2 supervisors, 2 weed identifiers, 5 herbicide applicators, and 3 to 4 vacancies are happening right now because we're so short-staffed. Next slide, please. So I started out learning about Phragmites in 2019 from Julia Bonin. She reached out to MnDOT probably sooner, but it finally got down to me in 2019. And at that point, I was only IDing and not treating. I would say learning from her how to identify between native and non-native was really important right away, so that I don't have to wait for somebody to verify that that's what it is, and I can go ahead and treat it right away. Also with her group, they taught us best practice or best management practices and how the Phragmite has been spreading and what to use. And we started out using glyphosate and then moved into using habitat the following year. It just seemed to work better for us. So Julia every year sends me a master list of all known locations on MnDOT, which I have my own list, and I can talk about that a little bit later. And I just check her list, make sure everything that I have is on her list, and vice versa. Next slide. So we use EdMaps as a weed identifier. We use EdMaps, and that has been by far the most convenient way of keeping track of every single population and what we've been doing for them each year, treating, finding no regrowth, everything like that. So if you're not using EdMaps, hopefully you have a different system that'll work just as well. Otherwise, I would say please use EdMaps. That way we can share our information throughout the state, country. Next slide. So this is a copy of my master list, and what we do is we have 2 weed identifiers, and we are the only 2 that treat non-native Phragmites. at the end of this year, we ended up having 423 areas to treat. And so I set out on the East Metro, and my cohort, Andy, sets out on the West Metro. We visit each site in our area separately, and then we write down if it's eradicated or just no regrowth, we don't consider it really eradicated, or if we treat it, or if we treated it with a hand sprayer. And if it's too big to treat with a hand sprayer, then we'll just write a T on our list, which is that first column there, and a later time, and we'll treat it with the truck mounted sprayer. Also, I'd say just making my list really streamlined for the reporting that I have to do. I have to do a spray report, and then once I get back, I have to report my time, which includes the spray report. So I add a lot of information on this, like mile markers, to just kind of make it really fast. The paperwork is kind of a pain for me, but I'd rather be out treating and looking. Next slide. So these are my tools. It's pretty funny that the man down in the left, that is my vehicle all summer. And I put a big yellow chemical container in the back, along with a couple of Hudson sprayers. I like the 1 gallon and 3 gallon, and then Andy uses a backpack sprayer. And then when we have a bigger population, then we use the pickup truck with a truck mounted sprayer on it. Most of our populations now are small, and so it's just a lot easier with a Hudson sprayer, especially if it was a big population and getting through all the biomass. I'd rather not have anything on my back in case I fall, but Andy seems to do okay with that. Next slide. So one of our major ways of spread is through the mowing. Like I said, we had 18 truck stations, and some of these people that mow, they've been here for a long time, and they kind of get into their routine, and they like everything to look like a golf course. So we've had a little bit of struggle, but what I found worked is we have a mower meeting in the early spring, and we invite all the people that mow over to one area and have a little meeting informing them about all the noxious weeds. So it's a lot of information. So I'm thinking sometimes that gets a little bit too much for them. So when I have a highway like I-694, where all of a sudden the median has an explosion of 30 different locations, then I will go and ask the supervisors if I can talk with the mowing people and bring them out to actually show them what the plant looks like in when it's growing early without the inflorescence on top, and get them to understand the difference between native and non-native. And then I'd like to also help them out by putting a hot pink stake with some pink ribbon on it, and I'll put that in front of and behind each patch and ask them to please not mow that area. Next slide. The other big way of spread for us is through construction. And this was a patch that I found 2 years ago on the right. It was a rather big patch, and got that reported. I treated the part that was on our right of way, and then informed the county and the town close by about that it's there and it needs treatment. Lo and behold, it was up for construction. So I came back this year and found this. And I always contact Julia as well. And she went out and talked with I believe she talked with the contractor and the county. And so everybody is aware of this situation where they put up silt fence, but as you can see, there's still non-native Phragmites in front of the silt fence, and they're digging in it. Of course, they probably have to. So now this is on our radar for next year, that we'll be watching for spread throughout this area. And I've contacted the truck station, and I will be up there next spring, looking around, and then also bringing them out there to show them, you know, the difference between the two Phragmites, and hopefully we can get this under control soon. In other areas, I've actually gone to the construction trailer, and I've talked to contractors, and I've talked to our supervisors, our construction supervisors, and just inform them about how this could be a big problem down the line if they're not more careful. Okay. Okay, so there is one of my pink stakes in front of a brand new patch. This is on in the median on 35. And unfortunately, that was an old stake. I didn't have any with me, but I found a stake and I just put the pink ribbon on it. And then the fellow that was mowing had to be a little further down, so I ran down and asked him to step out of the mower, and we told him what was going on, and he's more than happy to be part of this by, you know, not mowing through it. So I think just reaching out to people and explaining the situation really helps. Next slide. So this is on 35, and this was construction of a new loop or ramp. And the slide on the left shows where the new loop was going in up top, and then down lower it's the old road. Now this is what it looks like on Ed Maps today, because there must have been a couple populations there that we did not know about, and fortunately we jumped on it real quick, and now a lot of those would have been red pinpoints, but now they're green with a couple that we have that we're still treating. But they're pretty much all under control now. But it was it could have been, that whole area could have been covered rather quickly had we not saw those. Next slide. So next year, we purchased a drone. It's a DJI Agris T10. We'll be using this to get into areas where we were unable to treat on foot. This year, we only left one patch that's kind of far off in the distance, in a filtration pond that we didn't have our FAA waiver yet to use our drone. So next year we'll be using that for that patch. But once we had the drone, then we started figuring out it's not that easy. The people that are operating it need a drone certificate. They need an aerial pesticide license, and then we needed a FAA waiver. And working with MinVet, you also have to demonstrate proficiency with a check ride, and then they also do, I guess it's just a little test of your knowledge. So I'm really looking forward to using that next year, because we just got our FAA waiver just this week. So slide. So this is our list for our what we've done for the past few years. So as you can see in our total sites visited, that has increased, but the amount that it is increasing is has really slowed down. And along with the amounts of new sites that we found, that also is slowing down every single year, because I think because we're getting more of the mowers involved and construction people involved. Sites found or eradicated. Like I said, that doesn't mean that we're not going to visit that site. We will visit every site every year until we're sure that it's eradicated. This year we treated 188 sites. There's a breakdown of me and Andy, and we did use the contractor that was provided by the U of M for the past several years. And this year, something about funding was getting a little scarce, so actually took everything on us and have to say we were able to treat everything. I also like to know how many we're treating with a Hudson sprayer, but then I found out that I would take the pickup sprayer, and if there was a nearby population that was smaller, I was using that as the pickup sprayer. So I'll get that fixed up for next year, so I know which ones are the bigger sites and how many bigger sites we have and how many smaller. We did have 8 sites this year that did get mowed, but we caught that early on. So then we went back and we put stakes out and treated, came back later once there was some growth and treated those areas. So hopefully that was effective. So the one site was non-treated this year. That's for the drone next year. And then we have some sites that have regrowth that are not on the right of way, but we will continue checking those. So this year we started later in end of July, and we ended about the same time as the year before. I was really happy with that we got 423 sites done in that amount of time, but that's all because of previous year's work and making these sites smaller and smaller. And next slide. And there's some biomass and me trying to get through some biomass, and it is a workout for sure. I just wanted to say thank you for your time, and I want to say thank you to everybody that works on non-native Phragmites and who help us treat it and know best practices, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your wonderful presentations. And now we have an opportunity for people who are on the call, if there are any questions. And if all the speakers could turn their cameras back on, so if people have a question for you, they can talk to you directly. So I'll maybe kick things off. I don't see anything in the chat. So if you do have a question, put your question in the chat, or you can even feel free to take yourself off mute and ask your question directly. We'll take them either way. So I'll kick us off because I don't see anything in the chat yet. So one question I had was, so I work, a lot with utility companies on right-of-ways as well as solar sites. So this is a 2-part question. So I was wondering, have there been any cases of invasive Phragmites on solar farms? And the second part was, grazing was mentioned earlier as a management tool, but mostly I saw pictures of cattle. So on our utilities, we oftentimes use sheep or sometimes goats on right-of-ways to control vegetation. And I was wondering if we had any data on the effectiveness of sheep and goats to control Phragmites.
I can take the grazing question. So out in Utah, it's mostly cattle, but there are a couple papers that have done goat. I think it was goat grazing, kind of high intensity in smaller areas, and they found those to be similarly effective. The goats will eat it, so yeah, I think it's fair game.
And I can chime in on the solar farm question. So there is one patch that we have that is located near a solar farm. So, these aren't really not exactly rights of way, but they're kind of often put in along highway construction and like new developments. So I guess it is something for this group, to be thinking about potentially and aware of. One thing we're kind of wondering about is if when those solar farms go in, if they're required to put in like a stormwater pod with that, like the one that we have, that is the case. But it just seems to be another place to be on the lookout. Is there anything, Julia, that you would add to that?
Yeah, not really. It seems like it's maybe a one-off for us, but something to be aware of. In general, we know that stormwater ponds around new development is a problem. That is one area where we're finding a lot of new populations particularly for us in the West Metro. And that becomes an exacerbated problem when there's a lot of pressure from existing populations and the seed blowing into those sites, which is what we think is happening.
Okay. So I do see we have a question in the chat. Are you aware of any data or research on the fire risks and associated social costs of Phragmites?
Christine?
Yeah, the fire risk one, I mentioned that in the talk, and I actually don't know what data is out there on that. So that would be interesting to search. I'm not familiar, but I know Karin has a couple of initiatives where she's done kind of social studies of Phragmites, the implications of Phragmites for kind of the regions where she's studying it, as well as kind of like how managers work together and kind of highlighting that. So, so that's what comes to mind.
Let's
One
see.
thing I could add about Claire really quick is that we have a lot of populations on private land, and because they're smaller populations, fire is probably not a tool that we would be able to use to a large extent in Minnesota, given the landscape context of a lot of our populations.
Sure.
And I would say in the metro, I asked for one spot to be burned, and when I saw pictures of that spot this year, it doesn't look like it ended up getting burned, but it's kind of just really risky for us with the amount of traffic we have on this side of the road, so that's probably not an option for us.
So a couple more have come in. So the first one is, do you guys have any information on whether Phragmites releases allelopathic chemicals?
Christine, do you know that?
I actually am not familiar with any research on that.
Yeah, I think it doesn't need allelopathic chemicals because, as Christine alluded to, it has like massive amounts of biomass, above ground biomass, but it does also have massive amounts of below ground biomass. And so it can simply exclude competition by physical force in its presence.
Christine, you mentioned mowing in your talk, and how that can really help reduce seed production. I was wondering, like, how many years of mowing do you need to do to really start to make a dent in that reduction in your seed bank?
Yeah, so mowing, you would basically have to mow it every year to continuously get that benefit of reducing the seed. Because if you mow it year one and then year two, you leave it alone, it'll produce seeds the next year.
Okay.
So it's a long-term thing, but if mowing is already kind of a part of your management profile, kind of targeting the timing to eliminating seed is a good strategy if it's possible.
So I know we're, Allison, do you want me to stop to give you a minute to wrap up? There's still some more questions in the chat, but I don't think I'm going to get to all of them. Do you want me to squeeze in one more, or do you want to wrap up the webinar since we're almost at time?
Squeeze in one more, and then I'll just do any last announcements with any extra time if anybody's able to stick around.
Okay. Can you guys see the questions in the chat? There was a question on habitat versus chemical treatment, cattle grazing, looking at feces for seed traces, or the best way to work with the city to treat Phragmites near urban farms. Does anyone want to take the shot at their favorite question there?
Loni, would you like to cover the different chemicals there at all? Just with what you've seen on the ground?
So are you talking about the
Preference for habitat
Dan
versus
asked.
glyphosate?
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. The first year when we used glyphosate, it just seemed like it was denting. And then, so the second year we started using imazapyr, and we used Habitat, which is an aquatic, and it was gangbusters different. It was wiping it out. But also, I mean, we did have 2 years of drought. And Christine, I was really interested to hear your comments about that, because it seemed like it was working really well, and I didn't know if it was the habitat or if it was the drought. So I just prefer the imazapyr. It just seems to like stick in the ground a little bit longer too, I think, which kind of helps with killing the rhizome a little better. So that's my 2 cents there.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thanks for the questions, especially Dan. And Allison, I'll turn it over to you to wrap it up. And thanks everyone for giving such a wonderful presentation and great Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much to all of our presenters again. Fantastic work. And yeah, for anybody who was able to stick around, we have a couple of announcements. We will also be following up this presentation probably with some more answers to your questions, if anything that didn't get answered. So yeah, just wanted to draw to attention that the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group is hosting the North American Monarch Summit along with Monarch Joint Venture. That is going to be this June in Minneapolis. And this summit will allow any attendees with the opportunity to connect with multi-sector conservation partners from across the US, Canada, and Mexico. It is a tri-national meeting. Attendees will also be able to hear updates on policies, science, technology, and pollinator conservation initiatives from across the continent. And then we'll also have rowing-led breakout sessions on different topics such as the ESA and Rights of Way, the Monarch CCAA, our geospatial habitat database, some exciting field tours, and more. So there's a QR code up there on the screen if you want to learn more and register. Early bird registration is open. And for anybody who would like to potentially participate in the summit, our abstract window is open until November 15th. So invite everyone to check that out. And then we are also going to be hosting our next Growing Chicago Habitat meeting for anybody who is local to the Chicago area, including Northwest Indiana and Southeast Wisconsin. So that'll be on December 3rd from 8:30 to 1 p.m. in Merrillville, Indiana. During the meeting, participants will be able to learn more about different conservation and community engagement activities in the Chicago wilderness region, as well as connect with others engaged in environmental initiatives to find opportunities to collaborate across sectors. And Chelsey had another webinar series that she wanted to advertise, so I'll turn it back over to her real quick.
Yeah, thanks so much for giving us a chance to highlight this. So Julia and I also coordinate this ecological restoration training cooperative, and we host a webinar series for those of you who are also interested in restoration more broadly. The first one is tomorrow at noon, and so there's a link there, but if you just Google Improving Restorations, UMN, you will probably find it. So yeah, check it out if you're interested. Thank you.
Thanks, Chelsey. Yeah, and we did put all of these webinars up on Rowing's events calendar as well. So that's another way to access them. All right, and thank you so much for everyone for attending this webinar and to all of our speakers. Again, here is our ways to connect with us. We have a LinkedIn page and of course our website. And then also invite everybody to please take our post-attendance survey. It'll be auto-generated at the end of the call, as well as be sent out in an email right afterwards. You can submit suggestions for future topics that you would like to see covered and any feedback that you have on today's presentation. So thanks so much, everyone. Hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.